Yep, we need to talk about forgetting and memory construction and amnesia, all of those things. So this is our last video for our unit on memory. So let's get in and find out what makes us forget and why do we remember things that maybe really didn't happen. So forgetting, which all of us have been guilty of at some point in our life, forgetting is actually the inability to retrieve information due to poor storage, poor encoding, or poor retrieval. That's why we forget. So when we talk about forgetting and we talk about encoding failure, what it comes down to is it's not possible for you to remember what you did not encode. If you're not paying attention or you're not entering that information, rehearsing that information, putting it into long-term memory in the first place, there's no way you're going to be able to retrieve it later. So if it's information that you want to be there, you have to pay attention. You have to rehearse. Otherwise, that information doesn't exist. Your memory is not magic. So an example here, a kid is watching his favorite television show and his mom comes in and reminds him to make his bed. And the reality is what ends up happening is he doesn't make his bed. He actually forgets to make his bed after the show. Why is that? Because it wasn't important to him. It wasn't important to him. And so that task of making his bed never made it into his memory. It literally went in one ear and out the other. That was encoding failure. Another way that we lose memory is what's called storage decay. And when things decay, they kind of get older and they're not as sturdy and durable as they once were. And the reality is with our memories, they fade. And if you don't use it, you could lose it. So the poor durability of those memories can lead to their decay. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are gone. It just means that you may not remember all of those little details that you might have remembered closer to the time that you made that memory. And so due to the gradual fading of the memory trace in the brain, those memories, because you haven't rehearsed them, you haven't used it, they are just not as strong and efficient as they once were. So it's highly possible that as a high school student, you have forgotten some of the state capitals. And maybe that was something you learned in the 4th grade. And even with hints, you can't recall them. And what has happened, what that is called, is storage decay. So there's been some research done by a psychologist named Ebbinghaus. And he actually was a one-man show. He did the research on himself. And what he was looking at is just how strong is our memory. And Ebbinghaus took it upon himself to memorize small pieces of kind of ridiculous, silly, made-up words. And he had a ridiculously long list of these words. And he worked and he worked and he worked to try to remember as many of them as he possibly could. And what ended up happening was after he was done learning the silly nonsense syllables, he would return to that list and track to see how much he could remember. And he did this recall immediately, 20 minutes later, an hour, and even up to 31 days later. And what he found is that there is a definite decrease in our brain's ability to retain memory over time. We lose the information gradually, but it's never going to all be there. And unless the knowledge is consciously reviewed time and time again, it's going to be lost. And I think there's a really important lesson here as a student. If you think about sitting in class, going through lectures, and then leaving class, by the time you come back in 24 hours, you have probably, according to Ebbinghaus, you've probably already forgotten 75% of what you learned in class that day, unless you make some effort to put that information into your long-term memory. If you do nothing with it, there is no way, science says there is no way that you are going to be able to retain that information. So another reason why we forget is something called retrieval failure. So the information is in your memory, it's there, but you just can't access it. And there are a number of things that could be happening. One of those retrieval failures is something that we call the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you know it's there, you know the answer, there's a song on the radio, you know what it is, but you just can't pull that information out of your head. It's possible that there are some missing retrieval cues. You don't have little bits of information that might help you to remember that information. And then there are another couple of types of retrieval failure that we need to look at, and that's what we call interference and motivated forgetting. So retrieval failure, a type of retrieval failure, is what we call interference. And when you're learning information, learning new information has the potential to disrupt your ability to retrieve other information. And so the first type of interference is what we call proactive interference. Proactive interference. With proactive interference, the old information is going to interfere or get in the way with your ability to remember new information. The old information interferes with the new information. So an example of proactive interference would be that you had a cell phone and it got stolen, and now you have a new phone with a new number. But because of proactive interference, the old information, your old cell phone number, is getting in the way of you remembering your new cell phone number. So proactive interference, the old gets in the way of the new. The other type of interference is called retroactive interference. And with retroactive, it's just the opposite. The new information is going to get in the way with the old information. Retroactive, new information gets in the way of old information. So think of yourself as a math student. Maybe you're in calculus, but you can't remember how to solve a geometry question that your younger sister has, because the new information that you've learned in calculus is blocking and interfering with your ability to remember and recall geometry. So that's retroactive interference. This is a concept that definitely is going to take some practice, and you can be assured that we will work on this when we meet in class. So some interesting additional information about retroactive interference is the fact that sleep actually protects our memories. And sleep will prevent retroactive interference, helping you to recall information even better. So the bottom line with all of this is, when it comes to you and your studying, it's okay to study the night before, but you have to be sure, according to research, that you seal it with a good night's sleep. Because if you stay awake, your brain is basically tired. It loses that ability to differentiate between the things that you know and the things that you knew before. And all of those pieces of information are going to get clouded together. So with motivated forgetting, another aspect of retrieval issues, sometimes we just intentionally forget things we don't want to remember. This is definitely a Freudian concept, and Freud would label this repression. And repression is a type of defense mechanism that keeps our anxiety away. That if a memory is going to make us feel bad, create anxiety, we are going to block it out of our mind. We are going to repress that memory. And this is what motivated forgetting is. So there's a lot of reasons why we forget. We forget because we lose information. We forget because we have changed the information slightly and we've created it into something that works for us. Sometimes memory loss is due to other factors, and it could be biological. So there's a number of reasons why we forget. And we're going to continue looking at forgetting. And we need to look at what is known as amnesia. And amnesia is a partial or complete loss of memory. You forget. This is a physical condition. So physically, some things that can happen to an individual if they have amnesia, they could have suffered some sort of brain trauma, and there's damage to part of the brain. Someone who suffers from Alzheimer's disease, who's had a stroke, and again, that trauma, those are things that can cause a person to lose memory. Amnesia can also be brought on by psychological reasons. There could have been something traumatic in a person's life that they are blocking out those memories. It is possible with psychological causes for amnesia, it's possible for those memories to return over time. That could involve some therapy and some work, and sometimes just getting further away from that moment of trauma can help bring some of those memories back as well. When we talk about amnesia, we need to know that there are two types of amnesia. Forgetting things is one thing, but do you forget things before or after the incident? So retrograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is the inability to remember events that occurred before the trauma or the disease. So here you are right now. You have no memory of everything that happened to you prior to getting Alzheimer's disease, a brain trauma, having a stroke. Your past is gone. Retrograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is the inability to remember ongoing events after the incidence of trauma or the onset of disease. You remember who people are. You remember what made you who you were, but you have lost the ability from that point in time to remember things on a day-to-day basis. So I've made a note here on this slide. There are some confusing pairs as we've talked about forgetting. So please take the time to make a little effort to make sure that you are clear on retrograde amnesia and that you don't get it confused with retroactive interference. Those are very similar words, and it can be tricky to differentiate sometimes. So a little bit of review here on the types of amnesia. So if you're familiar with the Drew Barrymore movie, 50 First Dates, she is unable to form new memories following a traumatic brain injury that she had in a car accident. So she can't hold on to things that are happening after the injury. So that is anterograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia could be explained by the movie The Vow, and the actress Rachel McAdams' amnesia starts at a certain date in her past, and then she forgets everything leading up to the present, including her husband. So she doesn't remember anything before the accident. And that's retrograde amnesia. So a fascinating aspect of memory is what we call memory construction. So we sometimes make things up. We sometimes fill in missing pieces of information so that the story makes more sense. But sometimes that information is not true. Our brain likes things that are nice and neat and complete, and it's not intentionally done to be deceitful, but it just helps us to construct these memories. So one of those concepts is what we call source amnesia. And that happens when we attribute an event to the wrong source that we think we heard. It's called misattribution. So I heard it on television. I saw it on the internet. But you know what? That might not really be true. He said, she said, and we don't precisely know who the individual was. So we have misattributed that information to a wrong source. True versus false memories, they often are real memories and they seem real, but they are different to tell apart. And just because a memory feels like it's real, it doesn't mean it is real. So just because it feels like this is what happened, it doesn't mean that is what happened. So the brain plays a big part of this. The brain can tell the difference between real and false memories. We can't. Our ability to think and verbalize things, that's not necessarily our brain telling us these things. If something was never heard, if you never heard that sensory information, the brain has no record of it. When you hear something, your brain is registering that memory into the temporal lobe, which is where auditory messages are stored in your brain. If you never heard somebody say something, that memory doesn't exist. And brain imagery would actually show in your brain no activity. So the research of Elizabeth Loftus, a very important psychologist that you want to remember her research, she looked into this idea of false memories. And she's actually a psychologist at San Diego State University, just down the road from us here. And what she did in her research, what her experiment entailed, was she contacted the parents of college students and got lists from them of some of the events of their childhood and asked the students to recall these events. And then she added events to the list. And these were things that could have been possible, but they weren't on the original list that the parents had given to her for her research. After repeated attempts to recall those memories, students actually started to claim that they did remember the false events. It's easier for us to give in if there is persistence on the behalf of somebody that is telling you something happened. It's much easier, it makes us feel better if we can acquiesce and go along and remember those events. And these false memories can be just as detailed as the real memory. So with Loftus's research and false memories. She began to look into the cases of people who were arrested and possibly imprisoned unjustly. So what does this say about eyewitness testimony? Is it accurate? Many times eyewitness testimony can be full of errors, Yet that's the one source that we have to gain information about a crime. So it's important to remember that our memories are less influenced by leading questions if you are warned that they could create bias. And we also need to recognize and remember that the passage of time will prompt our memories to fade and decay. And that the age of a witness is also important to the accuracy of the testimony or the memory. So there are some things that you can do to improve your memory now that you've learned all about it. We know that studying repeatedly over time, spacing things out over time, will result in greater recall of that information. Rehearse, think about the material, make a personal connection, create those semantic connections, and above all else, use the mnemonics that you have learned. And so there you are. You have completed all the information that you are going to get on memory.